Hey there, Radioheads. Welcome to another episode of Radio KBE. Today's topic is going to be what's at stake in this Kyrie Irving trade. So, this week so far, it's only Thursday, and Vegas Summer League is upon us. This week so far, the week started off with Shams saying that the Lakers had no traction in regards to a Kyrie trade, and then the very next day, there's conversations about just the leverage and that there's just been a lot of roller coaster of stuff that's been going on over and over again, and this is pretty consistent with what I sort of said that was going to happen. You also heard recently that the Nets are very okay with taking Kyrie and KD into training camp, which is another thing that I mentioned was going to happen. And so there's been a lot of stuff that's going to get mentioned, and who knows when the deal will actually occur and stuff like that. But the thing that you've been hearing pretty consistently, I think Brian Windhorst has been on it pretty consistently. There may have been a few others, is that there is no market for Kyrie. Like any team that gets rumored as a Kyrie destination, that team, if it's not the Lakers, immediately comes out and just says, no, we're not interested in them. It happened with the Sixers. It happened with the Mavs. I'm sure that'll happen with somebody else. Does that mean that's actually true? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But this idea that Kyrie has like a market is just it's very hard to believe that there's a market there for him. It doesn't mean that people may not want to trade for him. It's much more limited when you know that he's may just potentially be an expiring contract. And then the other part is if he's an expiring contract and you know that he's not going to, he's only going to be with you for 1 year, then how committed is he going to be to play for you, like playing all out and stuff like that? And it's not the question that he wouldn't try to, it's not that he wouldn't try to like play hard and stuff like that. And I don't want to say that, but obviously he'd be careful about injuries and stuff like that and managing his health because there's a big contract extension potentially when he hits free agency next year when it comes to it. So there's a lot of stuff at stake here. But there are, obviously we're going to talk about the Lakers' interest. Like what's actually at stake here and why are you hearing so much stuff about just the Lakers not wanting to give up a lot for him and stuff like that. So I just want to cover that today and do it in a succinct manner so that it makes a lot more sense. So let's just get down to two concepts that I think are really important that'll help us understand what it is. There's basketball value and there's asset value. Okay, though that's the two ways the two frames that you have to look at this at, the two lenses that you have to look at it for. So the first thing I want to cover is basketball value. Russ's basketball value to the Lakers is entirely dependent on what Coach Ham feels that he can get out of him, and that's it. Like that's his basketball value. If whatever he thinks that he can get out of Russ, that's what matters, and that's why you continually keep seeing him talk up Russ. It's not that like he doesn't believe in him and stuff like that. Like it is Ham has to make Russ work if Russ is on this roster. That's basketball value. Kyrie has no basketball value to the Nets because Kyrie doesn't want to play for the Nets. He has basketball value to everybody else, anybody who's potentially wanting to trade for him, like the Lakers, but he doesn't have basketball value to the Nets because the Nets couldn't hammer out an extension, and that is a big problem. So when people turn around and say, well, you have to trade Russ for Kyrie and you have to give up unprotected picks to do it, that's not like they're using basketball value, right? Because they're very low on Russ's basketball value as a player, and they're very high on Kyrie's basketball value as a player. So it makes sense that if that's the perspective that you're coming from. But there's also basketball value to teams that we have to consider. And Kyrie has no basketball value to the Nets because he doesn't want to be there. And that's why when you hear me say stuff like he's nuked his market, that's what I'm talking about. When a player comes out and says, when they don't get an extension and they come out and say, I'll honor my contract, I'll fulfill my contract, and they're out. They're checked out. And so, how committed, how hard they play, all that sort of stuff, now that starts becoming a question. Imagine if Kyrie goes back, plays out his contract, how much scrutiny is he going to get when he gives up on a certain play? If he doesn't chase a rebound, or if he doesn't dive for a ball, or if he passes out of a easy scoring opportunity that you've watched him take over and over again, and he just makes it, passes out of it. Like, there's too much scrutiny that's involved with it. So there is no basketball value for Kyrie in that manner with the Nets. Now, if the Nets had just given him an extension and then quietly shopped him, there would be incredible basketball value for Kyrie. But that expiring contract doesn't work. And the way things have sort of been carried out through the public media, there's just too much negativity attached to that. So basketball value to fans and basketball value to teams is two completely different things. And on social media, we discuss things as if it's basketball value to fans, which rightly so. We're fans, so we're going to. But that's not how front offices approach it. They're looking at basketball value to the team. And the thing is, for teams that are out there, if Kyrie is telling them that I'm going to go to LA, whether that's true or not, the basketball value is a little tainted for a team that's not LA that trades for him, right? Now, that doesn't mean that Kyrie couldn't go and tell a third team, hey, if you give me a max extension, I'm on board. Like, that would, that'd be very, very different. But it's very hard to get to those conversations because it's free agency. And I would imagine just the contract extension is not the only thing that matters to Kyrie. There may be a little bit more that matters to him too, a basketball fit, stuff like that, just kind of where he's at, where he wants to be, that sort of thing. And that's equity that he's gotten because of his basketball talent and stuff like that. So that's basketball value. That's the way that we should look at it. The other thing is also this. If they trade Russ, the Lakers can bring back up to $59. By himself, the Lakers can bring back up to $59 million. So the two people that you've been seeing get mentioned is the other person you've been seeing getting mentioned next to Kyrie has been Joe Harris. And so Joe Harris was hurt. He got ankle surgery. He was rehabbing. Then he had to get another procedure, I believe, to get arthroscopic surgery or just some scope work on his ankle. And then he missed the entire Nets season. The thing is this. Joe, great shooter, tremendous shooter, one of the best in the league, very reasonable contract at $19 million. He doesn't have a ton of long-term money attached to him. But again, the basketball value as perceived by fans is he's a lights-out shooter. But the basketball value to the team is different because if Joe can't play, if Joe Harris's ankle is going to take him out, if it's going to take him longer, or if he can't pass a physical, or if it turns out that the ankle injury has made it significantly worse, like he's sort of affected his shot or affected his athleticism, whatever it may be, that's a big question mark. So the basketball value to fans is, oh well, he's a 45% three-point shooter. The Lakers should just give up the picks for him. Yeah, but can he play? Is he healthy? Like, that's that. When we say can he play, it's from that standpoint. Can he play 30 minutes a game again? Can he defend like he used to? Will he pass a physical? Those are things that we aren't privy to as fans. And if Joe's ability is sapped, or if he has to sit out 3 more months, if he has a setback, or 4 more months, or if there's something else that goes on with him at the beginning of the season because his ankle isn't all the way there, or his conditioning isn't all the way there because of his ankle, like, that's a big deal. I can see the basketball value to the Nets and the basketball value to the Lakers is very different than what our perception is as fans. And so, like I said, for fans, we look at it as just as it is, like it's NBA 2K. Like, he's a 44% shooter. This is Kyrie. He's one of the best scorers in the league. Obviously, we should give up the picks for it. Yeah, but there's other things like injuries. Like, is he going to be here? Does he want to be there? These are all parts of things that happen, in these conversations between front offices. And so that's how basketball value, that's the way I'm looking at the basketball value. I'm not looking at it from the perspective of, is this guy a good player or not? Like, it's very easy to figure that part out. You have analytics, you have film, you know if a player can do it. But can they do that? Like in Joe Harris's case, how does the injury affect him? Is there a risk that the Lakers are taking regardless of, because we're already taking the salary on, right? Like if we're trading out $47 million and we're bringing back $59 or $55 million, we're saving the Nets money, right? And that's when we start getting into the conversation of asset value. You may think to yourself that, oh, Joe Tsai's a billionaire, this money won't bother him. But billionaires don't become billionaires just by spending money like willy-nilly, like just randomly. Like if the Lakers are offering to take salary and reduce the Nets luxury tax, and on top of that, if the player that the additional player they're willing to take back is a guy who may not even be able to play because of his ankle injury or because of its worse, I can understand why the Lakers are a little more hesitant about giving a lot out. Because the worst case scenario that could happen is you trade Russ, let's say at the very base. They don't want any additional players. They don't want additional salary. Let's say the Lakers trade Russ and 2 unprotected first-round picks for Kyrie Irving and Joe Harris. And let's say Joe Harris can't play. You've lost the trade. That's going to be the perception of this. And as much as people would love to say, oh, well, Kyrie's better than Russ, so that's an automatic win. It's not. It's not an automatic win when you're giving up a lot for a player that only wants to play for you. And that is a problem. Like that we perceive things in that manner. I'm not saying you shouldn't give a first rounder for Kyrie. I think the Lakers are fine with it. I think the Lakers, there's just a limit on how much they're going to give up. And that's why you keep hearing somebody like Brian Windhorst say, we're not competing. Like, who are they bidding against? Nobody wants him. The basketball value is there. We're looking at it in that manner. But the asset value just isn't there. Like, that's not the way that, like, we look at things. And so the asset value to the Nets for Kyrie, knowing that he doesn't want to be there, is also low. Because the asset value on Kyrie is as an expiring. You've heard the term salary ballots get thrown out. You've heard the term, you've heard different terminology thrown out in regards to Kyrie. Like, his value is as an expiring contract. But the asset value for the Lakers is a little bit different, right? Because Kyrie still has his bird rights. So the reason why the Lakers are okay with sending a first-round pick out attached to a Russ trade, whether Russ ends up with the Nets or whether Russ ends up with another team, is so that we can get his bird rights, so then we can give him the extension that he wants. So there is some leverage that the Nets do have, and that's probably the main thing that the Nets have leverage over. Of course, people are going to be like, well, Kyrie's a better basketball player. Again, if Coach Ham is saying that if he gets this out of Russ, the Lakers will be successful, that is the basketball value. That's why the Lakers aren't under any pressure or under any deadline to make this trade and overpay for Kyrie. And it doesn't matter what fans say. Like, if fans turn around and say, it doesn't, like, there's a limit no matter what. Like, there's just no way. If Russ is on this roster, there's no way that we can win a championship. It doesn't matter because that's fan sentiment. What matters is what the coach says about the player. That's why those relationships matter between the coach and the player, the player and the organization, the coach and the organization. Because the perception of the player is always controlled by not just fan sentiment, or not by fan sentiment or whatever media coverage. It's by the people who actually coach these players. And so that's why that's why you keep seeing fans on Twitter or fans on social media talk badly about Laker role players, and then teams go and get those role players, and then all of a sudden they're amazing role players on the teams that they're on. KCP, Alex Caruso, Kyle Kuzma. Like, that's an issue. Like, fan sentiment doesn't matter because it's already been proven that players, when they change situations or when they change coaches, they can be better if they're not wearing a Lakers jersey. It's just perception. So there is asset value for the Lakers that we have to consider. And they do want to get his bird rights so they can give him a proper extension and stuff like that. If that's, because that's the obvious goal and that's what we want. And so when we think about basketball value and we think about asset value, that's really the main crux of this conversation. How much are the Lakers really willing to give up to get Kyrie and his bird rights? And so this is where all these different negotiating points are happening, Because if the Brooklyn Nets are turning around and saying, if the Brooklyn Nets know that Joe Harris isn't the guy that he may be, before his ankle situation and whatnot that knocked him out for the entire season, then what may end up happening is that they're throwing Joe Tsai into these conversations. The Lakers aren't asking for him. Like, they may be offering Joe Harris specifically for that purpose. They're offering him because they want to get out of his salary, because they know that he's not going to be playable the way that they normally like to, use him and stuff like that. And if that is the case and they want to change directions, then the Lakers are probably offering to eat that salary. And if they're offering to eat that salary because of how the trade rules work and all that sort of stuff, then there's no reason to give up additional picks for him. There isn't. Like, they don't want him. We'll take him, even if he's injured, so that we can facilitate this trade. But these are the things that are involved with why a player may make a certain, why a team may not offer additional picks, or why they don't throw in certain players. But even outside of that, even outside of this, basketball value, asset value, there is no deadline for the Lakers. None. Because you have a coach who's out here saying, we're operating basically as if Russ is on this team. These are the things I expect from him for us to be successful. That's it. And from there, that's all you do. There's nothing else to discuss in this matter. So that's what you're going to continue to see. More conversations about who's playing the waiting game and all that sort of stuff. And none of this stuff necessarily guarantees anybody landing somewhere or a trade being executed. But that's why you keep seeing so much conversation about this, and so much conversation about what's the actual cost of getting a player or not getting a player, and why you see the Lakers so hesitant or not overbidding or just doing it just for the sake of doing it, like, because there are other things that are involved. And there's also a part of this where we have to consider that the Nets may not actually want Russ on the roster. Right, like, even though he is a larger expiring and he clears out some additional salary for the Nets if we take on Joe Harris, like, that's why you're hearing teams like Indiana as a third possible team, the Spurs as a third possible team. You're hearing stuff like that because that's an asset thing, right? If the Lakers go to the Nets and they say, okay, we'll take Joe Harris's contract because we know he's injured. He's probably not going to pass the medical, but we'll waive it, and we'll add him anyways, and we'll get him with our rehab and stuff like that, and we'll get them to work it all out. The main thing is we want to get Kyrie's bird rights, and then if on top of that the Lakers say, okay, we'll send this pick or we'll send some second rounders to the Spurs or a third team to take Russ's contract because they have the space, that's something that we're giving to them. That's something that's an advantage that the Lakers are giving to the Nets. Why would we give additional first-round picks up? Who does that? All just because fans really don't want Russ on the roster? Like, that's not a good way of doing business. And that's the part that I think a lot of this stuff gets sort of lost in translation. Everything is being presented, at least to some degree within our fan base, as the Lakers are in a desperate position. But that's just fan sentiment. That's not actually what's happening. And so there are things that the Lakers are doing, and it doesn't matter what any fan says. Like, if we're willing to take on a contract of a player that doesn't want to be there, and then we're also willing to take on a contract of a player who may not be able to play, and we're trying to find a third team to take the player that you don't want, why would we have to give up so many extra picks? Why do we have to sell the farm to do it? This is exactly the same thing that happened in a lesser degree with the John Wall conversation last year at the trade deadline. Everybody was saying that you have to move Russ, attach the first round pick, go get John Wall. He was a buyout candidate months later. He didn't even when he got bought out, he didn't come to the Lakers. And you had people saying that we have to give first rounders. Why do the Lakers have to give up first rounders for players who don't want to be on their teams? Why are we the only team that has to do that? There's one reason that the Lakers would want to go and trade for Kyrie right now, and it's because we want to get his bird rights so we can get him the extension that he wants. That's it. There's no other reason to do it. From a business perspective or an asset perspective, there's no other reason to do it. Not if the coach believes that he can build out a roster or has a philosophy that will be successful. And that's what they're basing it off of. That's what the front office is going to base all this stuff off of. So this is not to say that we won't move Russ or we won't trade for Kyrie or that. It's just to give more context of how basketball value works and how asset value works and how these conversations that happen online don't actually move the needle, because when it comes to leverage, it's just a buzzword. There's reality when it comes to these sort of situations, and the reality of the situation is that the Lakers don't have to move anybody. They're not under pressure to move anybody because you have a system in place, and no matter who's part of the team, they have to adhere to the system that's being played. That's how it's supposed to go. That's why you see successful franchises or successful offenses not drop off, because they get guys who can play the roles within the system that you need them to play. And so with that being the case, like, I just wanted folk to discuss just like what's at stake here. Like, it's really just Kyrie's bird rights. That's what the Lakers are trying to get. They're not really trying to get anything else. And so all the stuff that you're hearing, obviously the Durant trade is going to decide a lot of things, but that's really just all it is. It's not much more than that. And there's no urgency. There's no rush. Like, the Nets can turn around and say as much as they want. They'll take Kyrie into training camp. Is Joe Tsai going to pay Kyrie Irving to stay away from the team? That's real money. He'll be paying tax on it. Is Joe Tsai, if Kevin Durant decides that he's okay with not showing up to camp and he's okay not collecting a check until he gets the trade that he wants, is that going to work for Joe Tsai too as well? What is the optics of that situation? All these small things matter, and the Lakers just have to be a team that's willing to be a participant in it, so long as the cost isn't high. Outside of that, there's nothing else to do. And you know, that's sort of the way that I look at it. You know, there are a lot of advantages the Lakers are affording the Nets, depending on what direction they want to go in. It's just a matter of time and when they want to do it. And the Nets are asking for extreme stuff, like 6 first-round picks for just Kevin Durant. Like, I don't know which team is going to do that. I genuinely don't. That's a lot to ask for a player, not of his caliber, but like of his age and just his ability and stuff like that. Like, how many teams have 6 first-rounders that they can give up and an all-star player that they're willing to give up, and then when they trade for Durant, they won't have any drop-off when it comes to their actual play, like their depth with their team and stuff like that. Like, you're hearing that with the Suns. You're hearing them say that, well, the KD really wants to get to the Suns, which is fine, but if the Suns give everything that the Nets want, and they're running a big three of Chris Paul, Devin Booker, and Kevin Durant, what happens when Chris Paul goes down? What happens when Kevin Durant goes down? All the depth that you had on that team is gone because you traded for the Nets. So it's really just based on what the Nets want to do. But the stuff that we're hearing about, like what's at stake, like LeBron's career is at stake, his opportunities to win a championship are at stake. Like, it's just people saying stuff. Like, if LeBron gets hurt 20 games into the season, if he gets hurt 20 games into the season, are we going to blame Kyrie Irving for jeopardizing LeBron's career? If Anthony Davis gets hurt again, are we going to blame him for jeopardizing LeBron's career? Like, it's silly to do that, and to sort of put it in this position that, like, oh, if we get this player, if we don't move this player, the window is shut. Well, the window is shut if the player can't play. So there's much more than just what your roster is, because if you could guarantee a championship in June and July, then I think more teams would be doing stuff in June and July to guarantee themselves championship. But basketball is played on the court. It's not played in June and July. And there's very rare cases like Kevin Durant going to the Golden State Warriors where you're very close to a high guarantee because of the talent advantage that team had against the rest of the league. But even then, injuries hit them in their very last year of that run. And they didn't win a championship as a result of it. So all that stuff matters. And I think teams in general are just going to be much more cautious, Lakers included, much more cautious about making these big splashy trades for players who lack durability, no matter how good their talent is, because it's a risky decision. Not to say anything about the talent, but just keeping everything together. Because you can trade for talent, but if you can't build a good team around them, you're not going to be successful. So those are the kind of different things that I'm thinking about, and why I'm not really in this place of mind where I'm like very concerned about making a trade sooner than later. Like if they trade, if they make that trade, right before training camp, Kyrie's going to fit in perfectly fine. I don't think it's going to be an issue. So, I don't think there's going to be much of a big deal when it comes to how this roster is constructed, and if and when this trade happens. It's just the conversations around it have to be a little bit more realistic. We can't continually keep saying that it's all about just giving up picks and getting it done now, because it's not like that. There is a lot of risk that the Lakers do take on, not with Kyrie, but with any of the additional stuff that goes on, if they decide to go that way, like Joe Harris's injury situation. And there are things that the Lakers are trying to afford the Nets, like a ton of salary savings, not sending the player like Russ to you guys and sending them to a third team in order to facilitate a trade and stuff like that. So there are advantages. There's much more than just the basketball value that fans think of players that have to be considered. And I think the Lakers are doing the right thing by not playing hardball or playing low ball, but just being a little more realistic as to what are we actually trading for. We need Kyrie's bird rights. That's like as important as his actual basketball value to the team. So I'll be curious to see what happens. And, as always, I'll see you guys on the timeline. I appreciate the support, and I'll see you guys in the next video. So if you can like and subscribe, I appreciate it. Helps the channel go far. And if nothing else, I'll see you in the next one.